Well, welcome back to session 2 of our Lament class today. And we are going to continue to discover what does it mean to lament and to learn how to practically pray these kinds of prayers. In the midst of doing this, one of the things that I've really observed for a lot of us as Christians is that we don't really know how to respond to people who are hurting. Like, if we're honest with ourselves, that's one of those really awkward conversations, right? When you come across someone who is hurting, who's going through a difficult time, you feel at a loss for words. You think, oh, I don't want to say this, because if I say this, I'm just going to sound stupid. And I don't want to say that because I don't want to sound uncaring. But I also don't want to stay silent because if I stay silent, anyway, you get what I mean. There's just this big, like, very uncomfortable space when we are around people who are hurting. And I think the same thing is true with God. We don't know if it's okay to talk openly with God about our hurts. And I wanted to just kind of frame this session with a couple of thoughts. First of all, I want us to think about our posture towards those who are hurting. Remembering that lament is defined as a loud cry, a howl, or a passionate expression of grief. That lament is prayer in pain that leads to trust. We talked about that in session 1. This is a time, though, for us to think about, like, how do we have a good posture towards those who are hurting? If lament is being able to express those things in reality, what does that look like? Well, Romans chapter 12, verse 15 gives us a bit of a picture of what it looks like to be someone who has a good posture towards those who are hurting. Listen to what it says. Rejoice with those who rejoice. We love that part of the verse. Someone's having a party. Let's have a party with them. They're having a good time. Let's all rejoice together. But then it says, weep with those who are weeping. The posture that Scripture calls us to is a posture of deep love and care for each other when we are hurting. What if, instead of trying to give people answers to whatever problems they're facing, what would it look like if we gave people our presence? You see, you don't need to feel like you have to have all the answers for someone who's hurting. You don't need to solve their problem. The gift you can bring to someone who is hurting is the gift of your presence. That's what God does for us. That's what He's inviting us to when we come to Him in lamenting prayer. I remember for myself in my own life, one of the most difficult seasons of my life happened when I was a teenager. And my parents divorced. I had all kinds of bitterness against my dad. My mom was battling with the fallout of a divorce and the realities of living with MS. And I can remember just going through the ringer emotionally through my teenage years. And I had two men who entered my life. They knew I was a mess. They knew I was a wreck. They knew that things didn't look good for Kirk. And these two men entered my life and they said to me, Kirk, when a divorce happens, sometimes people will take mom's side, sometimes people will take dad's side. But these two men chose to take my side. That's what they told me. They said, Kirk, I'm here to take your side. And I am so grateful for the presence of these two men. They didn't have answers for my pain. They didn't try to fix my pain. They were just present in my life, standing with me, encouraging me, believing in me, supporting me. They were a gift to me. And I want you to know that as much as we need to have a good posture towards the hurting, when you are hurting, when someone is experiencing pain, that there is permission and blessing even for you to mourn. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. He says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. In John chapter 11 and verse 35, we see the story of Jesus having a friend who has died, and Lazarus in the Bible, in the shortest verse in the entire Bible, says just these two words, Jesus wept. He wept. Even though he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, Jesus still felt the pain of the people who were there. He felt the sting of loss and he wept. When you're in mourning, when you feel loss as a person, there are going to be different emotions that you need to express, and it's okay to express those emotions. You may need to go through some type of counseling to deal with the 5 stages of grief. There are 5 stages of grief that have been identified. They start with denial, they move to anger and bargaining, and then even depression, and then ultimately coming out the other side of acceptance. That is part of the normal human cycle and journey of going through grief. And you may need to go through that. And it's okay if you do. I want to ask you a question just to reflect on for the next couple of minutes. And I want you to hit pause on your video after I ask this question. I'm curious to know, what are some of the reasons you think that Christians are reluctant to voice their complaints to God? Why is it that Christians hold back sharing their complaints with God? Pause the video, write down some thoughts, and then come on back in a couple of minutes. Well, welcome back. I'm so glad that you've taken some time to answer that question, why Christians are reluctant to voice their complaints to God. As I said in session 1, I think part of the reason, at least for me, why I'm reluctant to voice my complaints to God, sometimes it's because it just doesn't sound very Christian. Sometimes it sounds a little petty. You know, I think about all the problems in the world right now and all the things that God's having to listen to and all the people who are praying and asking God for things. And I'm like, is my thing really that big a deal? I really just don't want to bug God with my problem. And yet we are living in this space of lament where we are invited to bring our complaints to God. Mark Vrogop in his book says to us, lament tells you where to look and whom to trust when pain and uncertainty hang in the air that you breathe. It's such a beautiful picture, saying that lament invites you to trust God when pain and uncertainty are even just hanging in the very air that you're breathing. So how do we do this? How do we lament? Well, here's the first step that you want to take with lamenting. First thing you want to do may sound very obvious. You want to turn to God. Just turn to God. It sounds simple, but if we're honest, when we're going through difficult times, it's not the first thing we tend to do. When we are going through painful circumstances, when life is hard, it is not natural for most of us to turn to God first. What most of us will do is we will find ways to medicate ourselves, or we will find ways to get angry. So when I say medicate yourself, what I mean is you're going to find things, whether it's alcohol or drugs or pornography or food or television or video games or working harder to distract yourself. You're going to find ways to medicate the pain. That's just a Band-Aid approach. You're not dealing with the heart issue of what's really going on inside of you. You're just medicating the problem. Or the other way that we respond quite frequently is we just get angry. We're so mad about what's going on, and we just lash out to anyone and everyone around us, just venting and our frustrations towards the people that are surrounding us day in and day out. But the first step when it comes to any kind of lament is to turn to God. Listen to what the scriptures say in Psalm 86. If you have a Bible, I want to encourage you to follow along as we're working through some of these passages so you can see it. In Psalm 86, we will read the following words, beginning at verse 1. Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. And in verse 6, it says, give ear, O Lord, to my prayer. Listen to my plea for grace. Just think about what the psalmist is writing here, what David's writing here to God, what his prayer is to God. God, I need you to hear me. I need you to listen to me right now because it's too hard and it's too much. Turn to God as the first place. To kind of give more meat to this, turn back a few Psalms to Psalm 77. And in Psalm 77, we're going to start at verse 1. Psalm 77, verse 1 and 2. Asaph is writing the psalm. He says, I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I want you just to pay attention to the action words as this lament prayer is beginning. Notice the kind of action words he's saying. I cry aloud to God. This is not a prayer of just silence, but it's actually verbalizing, vocalizing. In the day of my trouble, I seek after the Lord. And in the night, my hand is stretched out because I'm so desperate for God to touch me. My soul refuses to be comforted. Mark Vrogop says it like this: to pray in pain, even with its messy struggle and tough questions, that alone is an act of faith. You might feel like the dad in the New Testament in the book of Mark who says, I believe, help my unbelief. You may feel like you have nothing really to get from God and no faith to ask God for anything, but just to even turn to God with your pain and to be honest and say, God, I just need you to show up. Even that is an act of faith. Keep going in Psalm 77. Verse 3 and verse 4 says, when I remember God, listen to the words he uses. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled, I can't even speak. What an incredible picture of a man who is going through incredible difficulty and pain in his life. He's sitting there and he's saying, when I even think about God, I actually moan. When I try to meditate on God's word, I have no energy. I have no desire. I have nothing to give. I'm done. It's over. I can't do this, God. I'm losing sleep. You're holding my eyelids open. I can't even sleep at night because the pain's so overwhelming. I'm so troubled, he says. The words can't even come out of my mouth. I don't even know what to say or what to do. And we get this understanding when we look at these words and these descriptors that prayers of lament do not guarantee that your emotional struggles are going to immediately lift. There is no promise or guarantee of that when you pray prayers of lament. We see that here in Psalm 77. This guy is lamenting and he can't even sleep at night. Keep going in Psalm 77, beginning of verse 5, he says, I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Here he is in this prayer of lament, and he is just saying to himself, he's wrestling with, why isn't God doing more? Why isn't God showing up in my circumstance? And there is this beautiful picture that you, in your prayer of lament, you can pray your questions to God. That you don't need the questions just to kind of swirl around in your own mind where you're going like, I don't get this, I don't understand this, how come this is happening to me? But that you can actually turn to God and ask God those same questions. That's exactly what he's doing. Can you imagine saying to God, have you forgotten to be gracious? Like, what a bold, courageous thing to say. Or like, have you just shut up and stopped being compassionate, God? That's what he's doing here in this prayer. You can pray your questions. Mark Vrogop says, honestly praying this way recognizes that pain and suffering often create difficult emotions that are not based upon truth, but feel true nonetheless. The reality is, what he's saying is that pain and suffering, it may not actually be really happening to you, but it's real to you because it feels real. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to, again, in just a moment, pause the video, and I want you to write down some thoughts around this question. I want you to write down one area of your life right now where you are feeling anger or grief or loss or disappointment. It could be something personal, it could be something bigger in the world, but just take a moment and write down what it is that you are feeling those emotions over, even if it's just one of those emotions. Pause the video and come back in a couple minutes when you've done that. Okay, we're back. Thank you so much for taking a moment just to be honest that way. We are going to move into step 2 here in terms of our prayers of lament and how we lament and come to God with what's going on. Here is step 2. Bring your complaints. Bring your complaints to God. Todd Billings has said it like this. Writers of laments often seek to make the case against God, frequently citing God's promises in order to complain that God seems to be forgetting his promises. They throw the promises of God back at him. This one blows my mind. Honestly, like throwing God's promises back at him. And that being in the Bible, and it's okay. This is what I call a gift from God. That we can be this honest with God. Here's some examples of how we might do that. Here's what you want to do. You want to be able to bring to God your why questions. Bring to God your why questions. Listen to what it says. We've read some passages already, but let me share some other ones. Psalm 10, verse 1. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Have you ever felt that way? You ever felt like you're going through a time of trouble and you're saying, God, why are you hiding on me? That's part of lamenting. Step 2 is, so step 1 is you're turning your attention towards God. Now you're going to start to talk to God. And you're going to bring your questions to him. Here's another one, Psalm 22 and verse 1. This is part of your why questions. My God, why have you forsaken me? Sound familiar? Before Jesus ever prayed the prayer, why have you forsaken me? We see the same prayer from David in Psalm 22. Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? So bring your why questions to God. But don't just bring your why questions, also bring your how questions to God. Ask God how. Listen to what is written in Psalm 13, verses 1 and 2. How long, O Lord? Are you going to forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Have you ever had that in your life? Those things that are happening that just seem to linger and stick with you, and the circumstances don't seem to change, and you're figuring out like, this is going to be with me forever. And you're saying to God, how long do I have to go through this? And this is what Scripture invites us to, is this space of bringing our how long questions to God. And then it's not just bringing our how questions, but also bringing your very specific frustrations to God. Listen to what it says in Psalm 10, verses 2-5. In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes that they've devised. The wicked boasts of their desires of their soul, and the one greedy for gain curses and renounces the Lord. In the pride of his face, the wicked doesn't seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. His ways are prospering at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of his sight. As for all his foes, he just puffs at them. This guy, the wicked, says in his heart, I'm not going to be moved, because throughout all generations, I'm not going to meet any adversity. His mouth is filled with cursing and deceit and oppression. The writer of this psalm is just kind of blurting out all of his complaints to God. He's bringing all of his frustrations to God. He's just simply saying, like, God, I'm looking at this guy who's just a bad person, and he's doing all these horrible things, and I'm frustrated by how horrible of a person he is. And God says, yeah, you can come to me and bring your frustrations to me. What an incredible gift that is for us. Mark Vrogop writes in his book that these Psalms give us permission, even encouragement, to lay out our struggles, even if our struggles are with God himself. And so here's what I want you to remember and to know, that when you start to move into lamenting prayers, and you start to wrestle through what it means to lament, the first step you got to take is you got to turn your attention to God. And then the second step you got to take is you just got to be honest with God. Bring your questions to him, bring your frustrations, bring all your concerns, and just tell him what you are feeling. Be blunt. He's God. He can handle you being blunt with him about what you're experiencing. Now, I know that for some of you right now, you're really wrestling. You're wrestling through the question of, this sounds like I'm sinning. And I want to say to you that there is a difference between complaining and grumbling. There's a difference between complaining and grumbling. And the difference between complaining and grumbling is simply found in being able to be honest with God. Grumbling is attacking the character of God. Complaining is being honest with God with where you're at. Listen to what we see in Psalm 82. Psalm 82, beginning at verse 1. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So the key to complaining properly and not crossing the line to grumbling is just to have an accurate view of God. You got to remember who is God in the whole story. So in Psalm 82, he starts with this accurate picture of, I know that God is God. He takes his place in the divine council. He holds judgment over everything. But then in verse 2, he also moves right into an honest expression of his complaint. Listen to what he says. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? So in one breath, he's saying, I know you're God, but I've got these questions that I just don't get. And that's the difference. The person who wants to grumble against God will refuse to acknowledge who God is. The person who wants to lament properly and complain to God is someone who is acknowledging the character and the power and the might of who God is, even though you have questions. Here's what I want you to do as we move to the end of this session. Before you come to session 3, I want you to do a couple of things. Make a list of all of the complaints that you should offer to God. Just literally write them all down. It could be one thing, it could be 100 things. I don't know what it is, but make a list of all the things that you want to complain about to God. And then I want to encourage you to take some time this week to turn to God and out loud, I'm serious, out loud, verbalize those complaints to God. Tell God exactly what you're thinking and feeling. Take that exercise before you move into the next session. Take some time and do this. It will prepare you for where we go next in our study.